Hi, this is Dr. Christopher Perrin, and welcome to this episode of The Christopher Perrin Show. In this particular podcast episode, I'd like to talk to you about the importance of recovering a good working vocabulary for education. You know that words are important, and that a good technical vocabulary is necessary to be effective and to understand well any discipline or field that you enter into. This is true, for example, if you go into computer science, or if you go into nursing, or if you go into philosophy. And if you become an educator, it's important to use words well. And as it turns out, there is a long and rich history of using words precisely and well when it comes to educating human beings. And so today, I'd like to review some important words that help us to understand the educational enterprise. And it's important to do because we still use words in education that we no longer fully appreciate and understand with the kind of clarity that we used to. For example, the word education itself. What does it even mean? Education can mean just about anything. You can get an education in manners. You can get an education in computer coding. You can get a primary, a secondary education. You can get vocational education. You can get higher education. What does it really mean to be an educated person? Well, we should look at the word education and its history. Think of the phrase, the liberal arts. Now, this one is one of my favorites because we still have liberal arts colleges, and some of you have gone to colleges and taken a liberal arts major. Well, what are the liberal arts? We know that there's at least more than one because we put an S at the end, liberal arts. But most people I talk to can't name the traditional liberal arts and don't know that there were 7 typical liberal arts, 3 verbal arts, and 3 mathematical arts. Well, we'll get to that, but we do need to recover a good vocabulary. And one way to do it, and it's not the only way, is to do some etymology, to look at the history of these words. Now, the word etymology has its own etymology. It comes from etymos in Greek, which can mean true, and logos, which means study or reason. So it's the study of what is true in relationship to a word. What is the true meaning of a word? At least what is its history or origin? Now, as you can even tell by mentioning the etymology of etymology, sometimes etymologies shine some light on an idea, and sometimes they can actually obscure. For example, the word nice. If you look up the etymology of the word nice, it's had a long history, and the English word nice is morphed and changed over the centuries. But its origin is in the Latin word nescio, which means I don't know. Scio means I know. We get scientia or science from that. Nescio or nesciere means to not know. So it might be that a person who's nice is also naive. And that used to be a connotation of the word nice. Somebody who is nice is somewhat ignorant. Well, that's not what the English word means today, so the etymology doesn't really help us that much. But in some cases, the etymology is illuminating, and I hope and think it will be the case with a number of words that we look at in this podcast. First, we'll start, and we will go in alphabetical order. We'll start with the word academic. Where do we get that word? And what does it mean? At least historically speaking, etymologically speaking. Well, the word academic has acquired a wide semantic range, meaning virtually anything to do with teaching, right? The academic enterprise. You might go to a school, you might go to an academy. What's the difference between the two? It has to do with teaching, learning, and education, but it's derived from Plato's academy, which some call the first university. And he apparently named it, his academia, after a grove of olive trees among which he started his school. This is some 500 years before the birth of Christ. The grove of trees was named after a legendary Greek hero named Academos, and he was purported to have saved Athens from destruction. So it was a kind of an accident of location. Where did Plato choose to have his first school or university? In a grove of trees named after the hero Academos, and hence we get the word academic. Well, that's mainly for fun. How about the word assessment? Assessment is an important word in education, and it comes from the Latin ad sidere. Sidere means to sit. Ad sidere means to sit beside or to sit with or along with someone. In the medieval world, this was related to taxation, when one would sit beside a judge who would determine or assess the taxes that you might owe. But note that the root meaning of assessment is personal, not abstract. To assess a student suggests that the teacher come and sit beside the student and offer personal, thoughtful judgment. What if our assessment was related to coming alongside a student and offering coaching help? Canon is next on our list, and canon is a word that comes from the Greek word kanon, which means a rule, a standard, or a measuring rod. We even get the English word cane from canon, and it's a unit of measure, a particular length. And it was used in ancient Greece to refer to a physical, straight rod or rule used for measurement. Metaphorically, it evolved to signify a standard or criterion by which things could be judged or evaluated. And in the context of literature, religion, and philosophy, the word canon came to denote an authoritative list or collection of works that are considered to be definitive or binding, such as the canon of the Old and New Testament, or the canon of Scripture, the set of texts accepted as Scripture, or the canon of classical literature. And of course, this relates to the great books. The great books are sometimes considered to be a canon, or at least to be assessed by some canon, some measure of greatness in order to qualify for anybody's list as being great. And we'll talk about great books a little bit later when we get to the letter G. Classical, how about that word? Classical is derived from classis in Latin, which means a fleet of ships, or an order, or a ranking. And so the adjective classicus could mean of first order or rank. Think about a naval group going out to battle. In modern terms, an aircraft carrier group, say, with the carrier in the middle and destroyers and minesweepers out front, helicopters flying above, etc. There's a very clear and definitive order for how a naval group, a carrier group, would actually sail off to sea. It needs to be ranked and ordered. So the English word classical was not generally used to describe education, however, until about the late 1800s or 1900, when traditional education was being challenged and eventually replaced by progressive educators who insisted on a new scientifically based paradigm of education. Now, we sometimes use the word classical to describe the classical periods of Greece and Rome, classical history. But that's not really what is typically meant today when we speak about classical education. Sometimes we use classical to describe linguistic study, like the classical languages of Latin and Greek. Well, those are appropriate uses of the word classical. But what about when we say classical education? We might not be referring simply to the study of Greece and Rome historically, or to the study of, say, Greek and Latin as languages. So classical education before about 1900 was generally known as education. It didn't need the modifier classical. Now we seem to be stuck with this modifier for better or worse. Today, classical can refer to anything of enduring value and excellence, as well as specific historic periods such as classical Greece and Rome. Classical educators today advocate for renewing the traditional liberal arts education that characterized much of Western civilization until about 1900. So we refer today to the renewal of classical education. Well, we could call that liberal arts education. We could refer to it as the traditional education of, say, Western civilization, or some other kinds of phrases and modifiers. But what it is actually hard to define, and I won't try to do that right now, but it certainly involves the 7 liberal arts, the natural sciences, usually moral philosophy, study of great books. What about the word classic? What is a classic? Well, this English word is also derived from classis and classicus. A classic work is a book that is of enduring excellence and that has proven itself by universal praise and commendation for generations or even centuries. Examples would include the plays of Shakespeare or the epics of Homer, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid, another epic, or the Christian epic written by Dante, the Divine Comedy, which consisted of 3 books, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, and Milton's Paradise Lost. These are all great, well-known, classic epics. Terms like classy, first class, and class act all reflect a similar sense of excellence, enduring excellence. And that'll relate to a discussion about what makes a book great. If it's a classic, it asks enduring questions, universal questions. It doesn't give pat answers. It's probably part of a conversation around important, perennial, ongoing ideas. And it has been praised for having excellence generation after generation, which means that most classics can't be published yesterday because they wouldn't have had the opportunity to be praised by more than one generation. How about the words correct and direct? We have to correct papers if we're educators, and we need to direct students. We hear words like direct instruction in education. Well, to correct a student's flaws means to set them, as it were, on the right path, because rectus, the Latin root that is a part of correctus, means right or straight. Think of the word rectitude. So, or to stand erect, stand up straight. So rectus means right or straight, and to correct means to help a person to be set right. To direct a student means to lead them along a straight path. An incorrigible student is incorrectable and is so captive to their vices that they cannot be corrected. How about the word contemplation? Contemplation is important in the history of education, and this word comes from the Latin contemplatio, which consists of 2 Latin words, cum, which means with, and templum, which means temple. Traditionally, contemplation connotes a set-apart and sacred space and time for careful, undistracted thought and reflection. The Greek equivalent to contemplatio is theoria. Theoria. Do you hear the word theory in that, or theorize, or theoretical? Theoria, which connotes the capacity to see and perceive what is true. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, regarded theoria as the highest human activity that would result in human flourishing or happiness, which he called in Greek eudaimonia. What about the word cultivate? We often hear in the renewal of classical education that education in this tradition is the cultivation of virtue and wisdom. Well, the word comes from a verb, colo, colere, coloi, cultus. Hear that word, cultus? That's the 4th principal part. It's a participle, and it means to till the soil, but it also can mean to care for, cherish, or adorn. So when we think of till the soil, oh, okay, we cultivate. Fields are cultivated, plants and trees need to be cultivated, but so do human beings. So it can also refer to the care or cherishing of people, or even of God or gods in the Roman mind in worship. In classical education, the chief aim is the cultivation of virtue and wisdom, and that's metaphorically very much like a gardener's long, patient care for plants and trees. Are you cultivating your students? Curriculum. This is another word that we don't really is easily confused today, because when you hear the word curriculum as an educator, you probably think of textbooks that you give to your students. And this has come to be a proper use of the word as it's evolved. The meaning of words tends to be their use, and we do use the word that way. But curriculum in Latin it's actually a loan word. We've taken it right out of the Latin without change. And it means a course that you run, or that a horse would run, or a race course. And it's it tends to be an oval or a circle, something that you keep moving around. But it's a pathway, a course of study. So it originally referred to the course of studies or the educational pathway that one pursued, rather than the published materials like textbooks. Curriculum in this sense is a path you take or something you do, not something that you buy. Would it be helpful to think of curriculum this way again? A course, a pathway that we are leading students upon, perhaps a course or a pathway that we ourselves have already walked. Now we get to the letter D, D for diligence. This word comes from the Latin diligo diligere, or diligere, meaning to esteem, prize, or have fondness for. When Jerome, for example, translated that famous verse in John 3:16 that says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son," the word that he used to translate love, that would have been the Greek agapo, or agape, the noun, he used diligere, which means to prize. For God so prized, had fondness for, esteemed highly the world, that he gave his only begotten Son. So diligence comes from a word that means to love, to esteem. And so a student, therefore, who diligently studies because he loves. I find this inspiring, helpful. The diligent student will be a student who loves that which is before him. How about discipline? This word is derived from the Latin disciplina, meaning learning, habits, training, or teaching, and is related to the verb disco discere, which means to learn, and discipulus, which in Latin means a learner or pupil. And from this we get the English word disciple. So in this sense, the disciples of Christ were not just followers, but learners of Christ. So discipline is to follow, has this connotation of following. Are your students following you? Could they, in one sense, be called disciples of you? Do they exhibit disciplina? And then the word education, now that we're at E. Education comes from the Latin noun, which is educatio, and it's derived primarily from a verb educare, which means to nourish, to raise, or to train. And educare itself is a blend of ex, meaning out or out of, and agere, which means to grow or nourish. So it means to nourish. A similar Latin verb contributing to the meaning of educatio is educere, which means to lead out, and it is a blend of ex and ducere, and ducere means to lead. So the Romans often translated the Greek word paideia with the Latin word educatio. To the Romans, educatio meant enculturation, instruction, raising, training, and the passing down and cultivation of virtues such as frugality, piety, gravity, constancy. Christians infuse this with the biblical ideas of mentorship, discipleship, and wisdom rooted in passages like Deuteronomy 6 and Ephesians 6:4, where educate, the verbal form of educare, is actually used by Jerome when he translates this passage, when he says that fathers should not exasperate their children, but raise them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So educatio is a rich word that really means nourishing, raising, training, disciplining, enculturating. Great books. Well, we should recall the definition of canon that we did earlier. While there's no final definitive list of great books, classical schools do typically seek to study those books which have been read, studied, and esteemed over time, often over a long time. To be regarded as great, such books are evaluated for their historical influence, universal themes that they treat, intellectual depth, originality, influence on other works, cultural significance, literary and artistic merit, and ongoing endorsement over time. So it takes a bit to qualify, doesn't it, if you think of that list, to qualify as a great book. And various lists of great books have been created at various times by different organizations and schools. And I encourage you to you can look up a list of books that have been published by a number of interesting organizations over time. None of them are exactly identical. There is no one pure list that everyone must conform to. But there's general agreement that to be a great book, well, it should be great over time, have historical influence, universal themes, intellectual depth. It should be a part of a great conversation, and it should have influenced other kinds of writing and thinking. That's what makes a book great. Humanities. What about this word? We use this a lot. Have you studied the humanities? Well, what would that include and what might it not include? Humanities comes from the Latin humanitas, and it means that which makes us human or fully human. It means our humanity. That's not surprising. Humanitas meaning humanity. Traditionally, humanitas denotes a well-rounded education through training in the liberal arts, developing one's mind and character through the study of mathematics, literature, history, philosophy, and the fine arts. Just note for a moment that humanitas was actually one of the words for education. It was a synonym with educatio, that educatio should enable your humanitas to flourish and come into its own, helping you to become the best version of yourself, to do what only humans could do in distinction from, say, the animals. Mastering word and number, that's the liberal arts. Studying the great ideas that humanity has archived, that would be the great books. Studying natural sciences, which would be to try to understand the world around us, particularly using the liberal arts to do so, and creating sciences like, well, biology, chemistry come to mind. Humanitas, therefore, is anything that you would study that helps you to be more fully human. Today, it generally refers to subjects like English, history, and philosophy, but it doesn't include the liberal arts generally. And usually when people say humanities today, they're not thinking of rhetoric, they're not thinking of grammar or logic, they're not thinking of natural science, and they're not thinking of mathematics. But mathematics traditionally was considered to be part of the humanities. It was considered to be that which helped your humanity to flourish and grow. So, humanities. Now we've divided humanities from the sciences, say, and from mathematics, but it used to be that mathematics was a liberal art and a humanities subject. And I think that should be recovered. Well, what about this idea of cultivation? You know, the term education, educatio, also connotes a well-rounded person who's attained some cultural refinement. In ancient Rome, humanitas represented the idea of education in the liberal arts and the development of one's mind and character through the study of literature, philosophy, and the arts. The concept's closely tied to Cicero, who used humanitas to describe the education that cultivates a person's ability to participate actively in civic life. Okay, humanitas has a rich history, and all classical education from one perspective is therefore human education, including mathematics and the natural sciences. How about the word intellect? This word derives from the Latin intellectus, meaning understanding or perception. It's directly related to the verb intelligere, which means to literally choose from among or to discern. That word intus means among, and legere means to choose or select. So you can imagine, like, even when you're reading a text, you have to choose, you have to select the letters and read them with meaning. And if you think about some of the ancient texts, there weren't even spaces between the words. So you would see literally a packed page of letters, and you would have to intelligere, you'd have to select and read them, discern the meaning from what was before you. And that becomes kind of a metaphor for all understanding. It's a kind of selection or discernment process. The intellect is traditionally the organ of understanding, reasoning, and comprehension. And it's closely related to reasoning from the Latin word intuior, or in the infinitive intuere, which means I gaze, contemplate, and admire, a kind of intuitive knowing that comes from gazing at something. Well, how about the liberal arts? That phrase, the etymology of that. Do Do you know why they're called arts? Why are the liberal arts called arts and not sciences or just subjects? Why are they called liberal? Well, liber in Latin means free. Free. This term originally referred to the education suited for free men in ancient Rome and Greece. The liberal arts comprised 7 arts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the verbal arts; arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the numerical arts, the arts of number, or mathematical arts. These arts developed a person's capacities as a human being, enabling ongoing learning and enabling or liberating a person to engage in civic activities and lead in cultural areas such as politics, commerce, military service, law, ministry, medicine, and education. They were liberal because they liberate us, and they were arts because they enable us to become makers, and they actually make us more human. Liturgical learning is a phrase that some are recovering because it's needed today. And liturgical learning means it's the means by which deep learning occurs and is fostered through sensory bodily rhythms and through all 5 senses. We might call this a form of embodied learning. But liturgical learning as a species of this is communal and atmospheric, because liturgy literally means the work of the people, liturgos. It's what people do together that's so formative. So liturgical learning is communal and atmospheric, and it consists of rhythms, practices, forms, decor, liturgies, and routines that cultivate the desire and longing among students to together love what is lovely and be in harmony with beauty in the world. What we do with our bodies is important, and what we do communally with our bodies is important. How about this word, paideia? Paideia is a Greek word meaning education in the full sense of enculturation from childhood, say from around age 7 to adulthood to around age 20. The word paideia is also related to another Greek word which means child. That would be paidos. For example, a pediatrician treats children. Well, the process of paideia was conducted by the family and the city-state, the polis, the Greek polis, and it prepared young men to participate in civic life and military service. It was full enculturation. When a Greek person heard the word paideia, he might think of childing. It's what you do with a child to fully mature and grow that child to be an adult serving in the Greek city-state or polis. As we've already mentioned, the Romans translated paideia most commonly with their word educatio. Paul uses the word paideia in Ephesians 6:4, where he urges fathers to raise their children in the fear and paideia kuriou, or the paideia of the Lord. Paideia meaning, therefore, enculturation, discipline, training, full nourishment, full maturation. We need to recover this word paideia. It's not fully translatable by a single English word, even like the Roman word educatio is not fully translated by a single English word, even though we translated education, which is now kind of mushy to us today. How about the word pedagogy? This word too, is from the Greek paidos, or related to it, which means child, and also the verb agein, which means to lead. So it literally means to lead a child. In ancient Rome, a pedagogue was often a Greek slave who led a Roman child to school and supervised that child's academic work. Today, pedagogy refers to methods of teaching that lead a student to understanding. But what if we recovered this idea that it really does mean to lead a child? We're back to the curriculum and the course of study. So walking with a student on a course that we have walked before, but providing leadership and helping them to see with their own eyes what we have seen. So pedagogy is a rich word, which means to lead a child. And then philosophy, and that's from the Greek philos, which means friend or lover, and sophia, which means wisdom. Philosophy, therefore, traditionally means the love of wisdom, and a philosopher is a lover of wisdom, someone who is seeking wisdom. So there's a sense in which our students can be budding philosophers. Traditionally, a philosopher is that, a lover of wisdom and a seeker of understanding. Now today, to be a philosopher or professor of philosophy is something more professional and involves some accrued disciplinary specialization. We understand that. But the original root of the word allowed all of us to be philosophers and calls us to be philosophers, lovers and seekers of wisdom. Poetic learning is another phrase that I think is worth recovering. Poetic learning is learning that is made. And this is coming from the Greek word poema, which means something that is made. Yes, we get our English word poem from poema, and poieo means I make in Greek. So when you engage in poetic learning, you're actually making, you're constructing knowledge when you engage or participate in something good, true, and beautiful. And so it's very participatory, and it involves a personal engagement that is also sensory and emotional. Poetic learning. And there's a book about this called Poetic Knowledge by James Taylor, which I think is really worth reading. How about the word principle? Principles of education, principles of pedagogy. What are the principles we follow as educators? Principle is a first thing. It's from principalis in Latin, and it means first, chief, or foremost. And it's that describes a given natural reality, something that's always true of the cosmos and human experience. And then when it's understood, enables us to live in harmony with reality. Therefore, it's a first thing. A pedagogical principle, therefore, describes reality in terms of how humans learn, and thus can inform and create and guide our various teaching practices. For example, one pedagogical principle would be wonder and contemplation, wonder and curiosity and inquisitiveness, cultivating this in students. When you can cultivate wonder in students, you're doing something that's profoundly human, because all humans are born with wonder, desiring to know. This is Aristotle's claim in metaphysics, that all men by nature want to know. We all are at wonder in this universe when we find ourselves small in something grand and infinite that astonishes us, that causes a kind of hunger and longing and yearning to know, and yet which also connotes our ignorance of this cosmos. That wonder is a first thing. It describes our humanity in a profound way. And so all pedagogy, or at least some of our pedagogy, should apply that principle, that we are at wonder in the world, and that wonder needs to be cultivated and stoked. How about the word reason? Reason is an important educational word, and it's from the Latin ratio, and it means calculation. It can mean affair, respect, something for our consideration. It can mean procedure, method, reasoning, thought, knowledge. It's even in Latin, it has a wide range. And there's a verb reor, which means to think, and there's the noun res, which means a thing. Think of res publica, or the word reify, which means to kind of make something into a thing. So res, R-E-S, is in Latin, it means a thing or matter. And so when we reason, we are seeking to understand what is before us, the things, the affairs, the matters, the facts that are before us. And so just thinking about it this way, ratio, think about ratio, think about harmony, or the way things connect to one another and blend. All of this is a way of exercising our intellectus, our understanding. So intellectus and ratio together in the medieval mind are both important aspects of the human mind. Intellectus is more of the gazing, receptive facility that our minds have when we're at wonder in the world. It represents like the open hands to receive knowledge, to gaze and stare until insight comes to us almost freely, as it were. And ratio is that ability that our mind has to connect things to one another, and it represents more of the reaching hand that's seeking to apprehend, comprehend, and combine. All of this is kind of in the etymology of the word reason from ratio. There, I rolled my R when I said reason. You should roll it when you say ratio. Reason. Okay, how about skole? Some of you have come across this rich Greek word that's often translated as leisure. Skole is a lovely Greek word, and it refers to something like undistracted time, to study something that is most worthwhile, usually with your friends and usually in a lovely place, an undistracted place, and sometimes with good food and drink. That's what Aristotle means by skole in, say, books 7 and 8 of his work, The Politics. This is a high human activity to engage in contemplation in an atmosphere of skole, undistracted time, to study what's most worthwhile. Ironically, the Greek word skole is the basis for our word school. And for all of the Romance languages, their words for school, like the Latin is scola, Italian is scuola, Spanish is escuela, and etc. And German is Schule, and of course English it's school. But there's not much skole in our schools anymore. Leisurely study with friends. So school, and we'll get to that word right now, school comes from skole, comes from the Latin scola, the German school, and our English word is school. The original meaning of skole as leisure, I think, should be infused back into modern schooling. Not that all education should be leisurely, but certainly some of it, a good portion of it, should. At least, like the Sabbath, 1 out of 7 units ought to be restful and leisurely learning, in my opinion. Science. Science comes from, we have a few more words to go. Science comes from the Latin scientia, and it means knowledge, and it's related to the verb scio, scire, to know. And the liberal arts enable us to create sciences or bodies of knowledge, such as biology or chemistry. Biology is a study of life and all of the principles or rules that govern that study. So the liberal arts enable us to create and then do sciences as we study the physical world and to come to knowledge of the physical world, of the cosmos. Science is from scientia, something known. And then student, which is from studeo, studere, which means to be zealous and eager for something, and therefore gives us the Latin noun studium. And studium means zeal, eagerness, or fondness for anything, but in the context of education, for something you would know that's true, good, and beautiful. A student, therefore, is ideally someone full of zeal and eagerness to know the true, good, and beautiful. Do you have students or something else before you? Are you a student or are you something else? Study, of course, is derived, the next word, study, is derived from studium, which means zeal. And to study means to zealously and eagerly seek understanding and knowledge. And students, and any human being, will study what he or she loves. Temperance, from the Latin noun temperantia and the verb tempero, temperare, which means to mix in due proportion. A temperate student exercises his capacities, neither too little, which would be laziness, nor too much, which would be a vain or excessive ambition bounding on before. So temperance is an intellectual virtue that needs to be recovered and understood. Tradition itself is from traditio. What is tradition in education? It means something handed down and related. It's related to the Latin verb trado tradere, which means to hand over. A tradition represents something valuable and venerable that has been preserved and passed down, and not something old-fashioned and worn out. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, calls tradition the democracy of the dead. And he says, we will have the dead at our councils. And just because someone has passed on from this life ought not to mean that his voice ought not to be heard. So tradition, something we receive. Chesterton also said that Education is the soul of society as it's transmitted from one generation to another. That's a good way of thinking of tradition in education. And just 3 more words. Vice is from the Latin vitium, and it means fault, flaw, or defect. Vices are the opposite of virtues. And this, in the student context, the chief vices that afflict students are sloth, which is laziness or idleness, excessive ambition, going on before what you should study at this point, violating kind of a good order of learning, fear, despair, pride. These things are some of the typical vices that need to be overcome by acquiring virtue. And virtue in Latin comes from the Latin virtus, and virtus can mean strength, power, ability, or worth. And it's actually in relationship to the Latin word vir, which means man. So man come into his own, a vir come into his own, has virtus. It can mean courage, it can mean manliness, but it also means essentially excellence in all areas of our humanity. The Greek word is arete, which means something similar in Greek. So the virtues are divided into the classical virtues of justice, temperance, prudence, and courage. If you have these 4 in spades, you are becoming like an ideal human being in the classical mind. But you also, if you aim at these 4 virtues, a lot of sub-virtues get pulled along with them. That's why they're called cardinal, because they're like hinge virtues. If you have these 4, you will have a lot of other virtues too. And then there are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And these 7 together form a great kind of mosaic of a virtuous person in the Christian era. A person who has justice, temperance, prudence, faith, hope, and love. And educational virtues, some sub-virtues you might say, they're sometimes called intellectual virtues, would include constancy, diligence, patience, humility, and even love. Love applied to your studies. Finally, we end our list today at wisdom. And wisdom is not derived from Greek or Latin. It's from the Old English, and it's related to the Old Norse visdomur and the German Weistum. The Latin word for wisdom is sapientia, and the Greek word is sophos, or sophia. Wisdom refers to discernment, knowing what is true and right, and understanding the world in a comprehensive way, seeking to approach the world in its totality, aiming towards kind of a divine understanding, of course, that can never fully be reached, of all things. So it's comprehensive, and it's a slow process, and it's one that is never finally reached, but stands as an ideal that we would grow wise. Well, I hope that this little odyssey through some important vocabulary might have been of some edification to you. I appreciate your attention as we went through this list. It's actually published online on my Substack at christopherperrin.substack.com. You can download this and enjoy it, pass it around. And there's probably some words that I should add to this list, or there may be some commentary about some of these words that would be helpful. And I would appreciate any of your comments, thoughts, and constructive criticisms about this list. But we do need to recover a wise and careful use of these words. There's so much richness packed in them. It's like going into a treasury to study these words and how they were used in the past. And I hope it's been helpful to you. You can find more of my speaking and lecturing at classicalu.com, and also, once again, at christopherperrin.substack.com. Thanks again for your kind attention. I'd like to thank you for watching or listening to The Christopher Perrin Show. And to do that, I can give you a coupon code that will give you 10% off on anything that you might care to order at classicalacademicpress.com. And the coupon code is simply CP Show. Thanks again for listening or watching.